The rain began as a fine, salt-pricked mist that crept in from Blackwater Bay and varnished the tiles of the city roofs. By the time it reached the red keep, the drops had fattened, drumming soft as fingers on the bronze bells beside the gates. The keep breathed with damp, the old iron in its bones leaching a faint tang that laid itself atop the sweeter smells of honeyed wine and rose oil and the sour reek of wet wool steaming on guardsmen's shoulders. Jaime Lannister stood beneath the shadow of the Iron Throne and considered the rain. He could hear it beyond the vaults, a distant hiss, as if the sea itself had crept uphill to whisper through the corridors. He preferred the sound of rain to the sound of wildfire. The memory of wildfire lived behind his eyes, a phosphor-green glare like the inside of a fever, and even now, deep under the keep, the alchemists kept to their furnaces like locusts to a rotted figure. He had been down there 2 nights past. He had seen the jars. He could still smell the oil. The king did not notice the rain or anything else, save his own thoughts. Aerys sat slumped and rapt, eyes glittering, hands busy at nothing, twisting one long curl of hair around the claw of a nail. He was muttering a private sermon. Beside the throne, the dwarf-braided pyromancer Rossart waited with the indulgent patience of a priest explaining sin to a child. Grand Maester Pycelle stood a little further back, heavy-lidded, whiskers drooping with the damp, his chain gleaming in the torchlight. Varys arrived like a rumor. He always did. He drifted toward Jaime with palms slightly raised, as if to commend him to silence. He smelled of sweet herbs to mask the city. "The prince is at the gate," he breathed, and his gaze flicked past Jaime toward the tinseled ruin of the throne. "With his own men. No banners showing yet. He asked that we tell no one." Jaime's mouth had already gone dry. "He comes here," he said, meaning, "Rhaegar comes to displace his father." "He comes," said Varys, "to end a madness that would burn us all to ash." On the throne, Aerys stirred, twining hair around nail, nail around hair, the skin of his finger pinked with pressure. Aerys had been beautiful once. There was a painting buried in some dusty library of the young king at his first council. Jaime had seen it by accident and been startled by the likeness to Rhaegar, high-cheeked, clear-eyed, with a faint inwardness to the mouth. That had been before Duskendale, before years of clutched alarms gnawed the cords of him, before he had grown as mad as a sailor left talking to gulls. "Your Grace," Jaime said, and his voice sounded young to his own ears, young and careful. "His Highness the Prince has returned to the city." Pycelle's eyes opened a fraction. Rossart was motionless, a branch of dried vine. Aerys leaned forward and those glittering eyes found Jaime. "At last," Aerys whispered. "At last he comes. The traitor's son comes home to set his father's city aflame." Jaime glanced at Varys. "Your Grace," he tried again. "The prince comes to counsel you." "Counsel me?" The king shuddered a breath that carried the faint smell of blood and sour wine. "He will be advised. I have given him instructions." His fingers went to his lips and came away red. He licked them, smiling. "I have told him what would be wise." Rossart's eyelids flickered once. Pycelle tilted his head, just enough for the chain to rasp. Varys's voice heard only by Jaime. "The prince will attempt this within the hour. There must be no alarm among the gold cloaks. The city will not be sacked." He said the last as if charm could make it a law. "See to the watch," Jaime murmured back. "The princeling wants no sack." Then, it was odd to think of Rhaegar as prince still, when destiny had already put its long cool hand on the nape of his neck. But the crown was only metal until you wore it, and the Iron Throne would not be soothed by songs. The hall was quiet save the rain and the scrape of Pycelle's sleeve and the faint hiss from the torches. Aerys had resumed his murmur, thread-like phrases about loyalty and faith and what must be burned away if the realm were to be clean again. Jaime watched the king's lips form the words and tried not to hear the echo he had been hearing for days now in sleep and waking. The words shaped into different mouths. Burn them all. The soldiers at the gates stifled cheers when Rhaegar came. He would not endure cheers. His arrival was a pared-down thing, stripped of fanfare, of noise, of anything that could be charged later as arrogance. He wore black and crimson, but the red was dark and dried. not the fresh cherry that went with summer and victory. A short cloak hung off his shoulder pins, rain-beaded and heavy. He had left a third of his men outside the city. The rest kept their saddles quiet, hands down at their knees. The prince dismounted deliberately in a puddle, and the splash made a circle about his boots. Jaime watched him come through the lowered portcullis with the feeling that always overtook him in Rhaegar's presence. It was not awe or the old adolescent worship he had once nursed for Tywin. Another kind of gravity entirely, as if a mountain had chosen to move and one must attend the shifting of it. Rhaegar's face was lean, more hollowed than when he had ridden north, and a line had settled beside his mouth that had not been there before. The breastplate ruby was gone, the famous jewel that sang about the tourney lists with minstrels' mouths. In its place, a simpler disc of beaten steel, buckled at the shoulder, plain as a miller's son. "Sir Jaime," Rhaegar said, and his voice was quiet. He paused just inside the hall and let the dripping halt. Varys moved from the shadow to the marble like a fish from eddy to current. Pycelle rustled. Rossart lifted his head. "Your Highness," Pycelle began, and there was a tremor in the old man's face that might have been feeling or might have been the weight of his chain. "It is good, truly, deeply good, to see you return to us." Rhaegar's eyes were on the throne. He bowed. He did not kneel. "Father," he said, and the damp air carried his voice gently, like a feather. For a moment Aerys did not answer, and then he laughed. A brittle sound, the crackle of bark on a winter fire. "You look pale," he said. "Did the North not kiss you gold as they did when you ran to Harrenhal to play at prizes before the small folk and their hay-scented daughters?" His mouth bared its teeth. "Or did a girl of the trident give you that paleness in her bed?" Pycelle let out a small noise. Varys closed his eyes briefly. "We must speak," Rhaegar said. "Alone. My son would teach me," Aerys whispered in a tone of mockery so gentle it came off as intimacy. "We will speak, you and I, when the city is clean." He lifted his head, and his eyes were bright now with something like joy. "Rossart," the pyromancer glided forward, a man whose bones had been boiled, his flesh tight as wax on his skull. Rhaegar's gaze shifted to him, and something flickered there. Not fear, but attention like a sword point finding an opening. "What orders has the king given you?" Rossart's lips twitched. "His grace has instructed us to make ready the cleansing of the lewd and the traitor. Justice is often fire." Rhaegar took a step toward the throne. "There is wildfire under the city," he said, as if reminding himself, and his hand lifted at his side and stilled. "There are jars beneath the septs, beneath the gates, beneath the rat runs that breed behind the potshops of Flea Bottom. You would turn King's Landing into a kiln." "Father." He did not look at Aerys for the last word. He looked at Rossart. Aerys rose with a sudden movement that made the bells above the doors tremble. "If the city is to be sold to Robert, if the traitor comes through our gates wrapped in lion's silk and goat's gold, I will give him a gift. I will give him the sight of his prize turned to ash under him. I will hear him shriek and call that justice." He was breathing hard now, hair clinging to his brow. "To cleanse, to purify, to make an end of treason in a pyre bright as the day the gods first opened their eyes." Jaime's fingers had slid unconsciously to the edge of his sword belt. In the low light, he could see the smear of blood drying at the king's fingertip. He looked at Rhaegar and felt the old balance inside himself tilting. A thing was going to happen. He could step toward it or not. In one version, he would be named for it until his dying day, and the name would fit him ill. In another, he might be remembered as nothing more than a boy who stood and waited for the rain to cease. Varys coughed softly. "Your Grace," he said. "There are other ways to conquer than fire." Rhaegar had not looked at any man but his father. He removed his cloak and laid it over the arm of a chair, as if he were a guest refusing to drip on the floor. "King Aerys," he said, and the title fell heavy. "You are unwell." He spoke it plainly, as he might have told a man his house roof leaked. "You are not yourself. I will not give your city to the hammer or to your flames. I will not." He stepped forward then and made a small motion with his hand. In the balcony galleries and along the walls, men in black cloaks peeled out of the ornamental shadows like flakes in a shaken snow globe. Gold cloaks, too. The captains Varys had been speaking with for a week, the ones who had watched the jars being carried through the streets at night with fright in their guts and were grateful to be offered a path that did not lead to a pyre. Pycelle gargled at the sight. Rossart's waxen head ticked to the left and right. "This is treason," Aerys whispered, but the force had gone out of him with the surprise. He looked suddenly very old, his mouth slack. His eyes were not even on Rhaegar now, but on the edges of the throne, iron swords that had cut so many hands that the tips were black with old blood. "Father," Rhaegar said a last time, and there was grief in it, grief and the smallest flame of anger. "You are deposed." The hall seemed to breathe in. Jaime's heart had climbed into his throat. He drew his sword in a clean, startled motion as a figure moved. Rossart, who had been waiting after all, bone-thin hands more adder than man. The pyromancer darted toward a door that led under the hall to the tunnels, where the jars were, where the dark oil glistened. Jaime stepped without thinking, and the blade went through the rib space with the same sweet resistance as a sheath. Rossart's eyes widened. His mouth opened and closed twice, and he sagged down the length of Jaime's steel as oil runs down a wick. Pycelle stood with his hands spread, palms out as if he were soothing a child. "My lords," he said, "hear me, for this is—" "Hush," Varys said, and there was nothing of the powdery pretense in his voice now. It was flat and very tired. "Let it happen. For once, let it happen cleanly." 2 gold cloaks had reached the steps. They did not touch Aerys. They placed their hands instead on the arms of the throne, as if anchoring the very metal from leaping to unnatural flame. Aerys stared at them and then at Rhaegar, and the old, burned sweet smile crept back over his mouth. "They will kill the children," he murmured almost dreamily. "They will put babes to the sword and fill the sewers with crimson. The stag will mount the city and break it on his antlers, and your sweet songs will not save you, Rhaegar." Rhaegar's face did not move. "Order the alchemists to quench the furnaces," he said. "Send to the septs and have the jars removed. Lock away the resin. The prince's word stands for the king's in this. And take my father away gently. He deserves gentleness if I cannot give him more." It was done. Not easily, not in the smooth sequence of a single hour, but it was done. The old king was led through the painted gallery like a child waking from a nightmare that refused to end. Mutter. And G smiling, sometimes shrilling up to a shriek that made the tapestries twitch. The red doors of Maegor's holdfast took him in and closed. Rossart's body was slid off Jaime's blade and borne silently away. Pycelle, after a brief fluttering protestation about the chain and the citadel and the law of succession, was escorted gently out as well. Varys moved like quicksilver, his wrists flicking this way and that, whispering to pages, to guards, to stewards. A rope of commands unspooled from him through the keep, and far below, in the alchemist's vaults, the flame in the curve-necked furnaces was choked and finally smothered. The rain had grown into a downpour by the time the smoke in those furnaces went to ash. Elia Martell held her children and listened to the different noises of the palace. She had learned the sounds of danger by the time she was 13 years old, for she had been born into a house that kept poison among its remedies and called a scorpion by its pet name as easily as a sister. Danger had a timbre all its own. It rode above laughter and music like a hawk above a field. The sound she heard now was silence after shouting. She did not realize she was crying until she licked salt from the corner of her mouth and tasted it wasn't the sea. "Are we to see father?" Rhaenys asked. "He stands, but he counts his dead." He did not say, "And I nearly joined them." He did not say, "The rubies in my breast broke when I fell and they skittered in the ford like red fish, and for a moment I thought the prophecy had mistaken me for a different kind of sacrifice." Elia had known him long enough to hear unsaid words as easily as said. "And father?" she asked. Rhaegar shut his eyes briefly. "Quiet," he said. "As a hive is quiet when the queen is taken. He will not burn our children in his grief. I have made sure." She had never loved him as much as she did in that moment or hated him more for what he had allowed to come to this pass. Both feelings lay together in her chest like two birds in a narrow cage. They pecked and soothed in turns. "The realm will not accept polygamy," Elia said, because she had learned, too, in Dorne, that to cut to the quick was both kindness and cruelty. "The faith will not sanctify it." He took the words and bowed. "I will not ask it," he said. The faintest smile courted his mouth as if he had remembered a tune. "I believe the gods sometimes care less for blessings than for promises kept. But I will not ask it. I will ask for peace. For a time. For a council to decide what oaths bind us now." Elia nodded and swayed a little, the baby's weight shifting. The ache in her back bit hard, but she kept her voice level. "Dorne will come for me if iron-trimmed men ride our corridors again and open doors the wrong way. Oberyn will come for me with poison or with roses. He has both hands. Dorne will be honored," Rhaegar said, and some of the tautness left his mouth. "I swear it, on this boy's life and on hers." He kissed Rhaenys' brow and she stared at him, hawk-fierce, and then, to Elia's shock and relief, she put her hand into his hair like a mother. The ravens spun out from the rookery with messages sealed in wax so quickly the rookery might have been the throat of a singer. The city tasted the change like salt on the lip of a cup. Rumors leapt alleys and climbed up through the terraces a dozen times before the truth caught up with them, and by then it had been flavored and spiced to suit everyone's dread. The king was dead, said some. The king had burned himself, said others, like a red priest from the east. The prince had slain his father with a harp string. The little birds twisted the stories into nests and Varys tucked them into place, setting watch where a spark might turn to flame and letting other sparks die of their own want of air. When the first rebel banner touched the King's Road within sight of the city, it was not Tywin Lannister's. The lion's strength had been hoarded and weighed, and for once the calculations were slow enough to be read by other men. It was the direwolf that came limping down the road, stained with the trident, accompanied by trout and falcon and the feathery scattering of lesser arms. They halted where the road dipped and a view opened of the river and the bay beyond, where the rain was. A veil over the masts of ships. Eddard Stark rode at their head, a man whose grief was beginning to turn to shape and weight instead of the sharpened air that had driven him forward these last months. He had dreamed of this city for so long he had forgotten what it would be to see it wet and brown and ordinary. He had thought of gates and fire. Now he saw a wet road and a wall with birds on it and a man waiting in black and crimson with raindrops standing in his hair. It was Rhaegar who came out on foot with only 4 men. He stopped 10 paces from Eddard and looked at him the way one looks at a man who has wounded you and whom you may still ask, if not forgiveness, then understanding. "My Lord Stark," he said, and bowed his head a fraction. "Your Highness," Eddard answered, and did not bow. He heard Jon Arryn's low breath beside him like a rope loosed. "We came to end a reign. Have we come to witness you begin one?" "Not today," Rhaegar said. "Today we begin talking about whether the realm will have a king who is not sick. I will hold your parley under the king's peace. You must come unarmed into the city with 8 men only, and you must give me your word that while you are within these walls you will keep your sword in its sheath. I will give you my word that you will leave the city with your life even if we agree to nothing. If you fear for your safety, send hostages for mine. I am not here to trick men into visiting so we can chain them." Eddard listened. Jon Arryn leaned near and murmured, "It is the only road that does not end with fire. Robert was not here." Eddard had argued that he must not come yet. Rage and pain still lay too near the skin, and Robert's wound had reopened on the last day's march, blood seeping through the bandage under his mail shirt. He had sworn and laughed and drunk the pain down and sworn again. He had reached for his hammer and would have ridden if Eddard and Jon had not taken his reins and given him a look he could not call cowardice without blushing later. So he had stayed, and he had sent Eddard with a raven-hastened note for the prince. "I will speak with you when I have buried and when I have healed. Until then you are a song I cannot hear without rage." Eddard did not share the words with Rhaegar. It was not time for that song. They entered the city by the king's gate in a rain that had thinned to a whisper. The streets smelled of damp bread and stale urine and wet stone. Women peered from above and children ran close behind to stare at the men with the long faces who had come so far to kill a king. Varys watched from an archway like a smile someone had drawn and then forgotten to erase. They were led not to the throne room but to a private chamber whose plaster had been painted with pale green fish and reeds long before any of them were born. There they ate a few mouthfuls of bread and cheese that might have been kindness or might have been diplomacy, and then Rhaegar spoke. "King Aerys is confined," he said. "He will be cared for. He will be allowed company and wine and a window. There is mercy in this or there is folly depending on how much of him you believe the gods have taken. I will answer for the alchemist's jars. If you walk the city with my escort you may see them being drawn out of the vaults and split open and the green oil drained off and quenched. No man will be burned today if I can stop it." Jon Arryn said slowly. "And tomorrow?" Rhaegar looked at him with that old inwardness. "I will ask the realm to call a great council under the eyes of the seven. There we will say the truth aloud. The king is mad, and the law does not know what to do with a mad king. We will call on precedent and on pragmatism. We will beg the gods to favor plain sense. And we will decide whether the line passes to me or to my son or to no Targaryen at all." He did not say, "It passes to the child in a tower by a dry spring, guarded by men who chose my desire over their oaths." Eddard did not say, "I will go to that tower with my own desire, which is not for a crown, which has never been for a crown." They talked for 3 hours and said too little and too much. When they left the city, Eddard had a cobble clinging to his boot heel and a question clinging to his heart. He did not know how to tell Robert what had not, happened without the words curdling in his friend's mouth. He did not know how to tell himself what to do in Dorne. Robert met him in a rain-pocked field under an elm that had been struck by lightning 10 years ago and had not regained its shape. He was pale with pain and fury, his hair plastered to his head, his eyes bright in the way eyes are when a fever has ambition. "They took his father into a tower to feed him cakes," he said as if he had been there and seen it. "And the sun will sing while we forget what they did to our kin." He asked for a pause to let the realm breathe, Eddard said. "For a council. We fought for a council?" Robert laughed, and the laugh was an iron thing that went wrong in his chest. "I fought because Rhaegar took what was mine and because his father burned your father while men watched. He burned them like they were long logs for a winter night." His voice went small on the last words, and Eddard saw the boy in him suddenly. The boy who had known laughter and a sword as if they were brothers. "You cannot kill them all," Eddard said, very soft. "I can kill enough." Robert's hand flexed on the haft of the hammer. He looked toward the city as if he could see through the hill and the wet to the Red Keep. "I will speak at their paper council," he said after a long stretched moment. "I will spit on their titles and say their names, and then we will see what men have the bellies to call me wrong to my face." "We will see," Eddard said, meaning, "we will survive the next days and then count our dead and our patience." Eddard went south before the council could convene. He did not ask leave. He only left 3 letters and a 4th that bore no name. One letter told Jon Arryn where he had gone and why. One told Catelyn Tully that he would return. One told Robert that he would do what kindness he could for a memory they both could not lay down. The 4th was the smallest thing he had ever written. It contained 2 words and a question mark. Ashera? He did not send it. He burned it with a clean flame. The Tower of Joy sat in the dry skirt of the mountains as if the wind itself had carved it there. Its stones were pale and threw back sunlight with an unwelcome generosity. Eddard came at dawn with 6 men only. Howland Reed rode with him, narrow-faced and quiet as water, and 5 Northmen whose names their mothers had stitched into small prayers. The morning tasted of dust. In the hush he could hear a lark, and then the metallic song of a blade pulled an inch from a scabbard. 3 white knights waited. They wore no cloaks today, only the plain enameled plates they had burnished with chalk and patience for years. Arthur Dayne's hair was not tied back but fell about his shoulders like cloud, and his face had the serenity of a man who has decided something that cannot be undone. Gerald Hightower stood beside him, large and grave. Oswell kept his gaze lowered, as if to spare Eddard some intimacy. "My lords," Eddard said, and his voice felt odd in the wide air. "I have come to take my sister home." Arthur's mouth made a shape that was not quite a smile. "Our prince's lady is within," he said. "We have sworn to guard her." "She is my sister," Eddard said more quietly, and felt foolish, as if he had come to bargain for a ewe at market. "Your sister," Gerald Hightower said, "was given into our keeping by a prince who is now a king or near to it." "Your oaths," Eddard said, and his temper surprised him. A new thing in him that had grown out of burned bones and open graves. "Your oaths are to the king. The king lives. He lives in a tower with padded walls while the realm argues itself into a fever. And if you answer me that Rhaegar is your king now, then tell me by what law. Tell me by what letter you turn your swords from the city to a tower." Arthur's eyes were not unkind. "The law we answer to," he said, "is not written in a book. It is written, call it in the blood of men. Call it in what is owed." He glanced toward the tower. "We are not keeping her from you. We are holding a time between two hastenings, and we are poor at it." Howland Reed tightened his fingers on the shaft of his spear. He looked smaller than usual against the bone-pale stones. "If the lady wishes to go," he said, "no oath should keep her." "Would that our lives were made of wishes," Gerald murmured. They fought. There was no avoiding it. Even if words could have borne them elsewhere, they did not have enough time to find them. The fight was not like the tales told later. It was ugly and breathless and full of missteps. 3 times Eddard slipped on shale, and twice he caught himself, and once he did not, and Howland's hand was there. The dawn widened and the tower threw a shadow like a blade, and in that blade movement slowed and quickened, and men made the sounds men make when steel touches them truly. At the last, Eddard's sword struck Arthur low, and his own hand was numb at the shock that ran up his arm. It felt like a sin to have reached so deep and found a man's life there. Arthur fell to one knee. He looked up at Eddard like a man reading a last line of a letter, and then he looked beyond him at a window where no one stood yet. "Go," he said. "Go quickly." Gerald Hightower had already taken a sword in the chest, and his breath came like a punctured bellows. Oswell went lay under the half-shade of a scrub bush, a color that was not quite white and not quite gray. Eddard ran. The tower stairs were a corkscrew. The air smelled of straw and lavender. He burst into a room where the light was soft as a breath. Lyanna lay in the bed, hair spent out over the pillow like black water. She had never looked so much like their mother. He thought that, and then he forgot it because there was a child, and there was blood, and there was love so thick in him he could not speak it. She smiled at him. For an inch of a second, the girl he had run through snow with and stolen apples with and cried with when their father went to the west was there. The mischief lit at the corners of her mouth. "Ned," she whispered. Her voice was like a reed on water. He knelt and took her hand, and it was so light. "I have you," he told her. And he softened the words until they were not the ones he meant, because the ones he meant were, "I have you too late." He did the things one does, changed the cloths, lifted the child, murmured nonsense that had to do with the names of trees and wolves and the taste of clean snow. "She loves him," Lyanna said, and in her eyes was a softness that turned Eddard's spine to grief. "Not the way I thought it would be. Not." Howland Reed stood with his head bowed, and one of the Northam, the youngest, with a fuzz of beard that did not yet trust him, wept openly and did not care who saw. Eddard wrapped the child in his cloak and tucked him inside against his chest. It was a far ride to the sea and a longer one to home. When he came again to the King's Road, the days had turned and the Great Council had already begun. They met in the September of Baelor. The dragon pit might have been larger, but too many men feared standing beneath the ruin where the bones of old beasts were said to whisper in the lamplight. The High Septon had put on the crystal crown that pressed his forehead with its many-pointed weight, and he swayed slightly as he walked, but his voice was clear enough when he asked for oaths and silence and patience. The faith had blessed kings and turned their backs on them before. Even so, there were older men in the pews who had not expected to see such a thing in their own lifetimes. The lords came stiff with mud or perfumed to the eyebrows. The small folk came to the square and craned to spy. Sellers of chestnuts pushed their braziers into place and found themselves elbowed aside by sellers of watered wine who found themselves elbowed aside by sellers of words. who took coin to tell the news inside from the pulpit steps. In the press, a pickpocket lifted a purse with a love note in it and was so moved by the words, he returned it to the woman who had written them. Inside, Tyrell men sat together like a beech wood, upright and numerous. Hoster Tully chewed on his silence with the concentration of a man who must swallow what he does not like the taste of. John Aaron looked as if he had been carved in the veil and carried down with ropes and pulleys. Dorn sent Oberyn, who tilted his head at everything like a snake listening to a flute. Doran did not come, claiming gout, but his words moved all the same, a slow courtesy that was soft enough to hide steel. The Lannisters arrived late. Tywin came in with the shadow of the rock on his shoulders and neither bowed nor smiled, which was his way of doing both at once. Cersei was not with him. Jaime, in white enamel and gold, stood with the other knights of the Kingsguard and kept his face as empty as the inside of a steel helm. He had not slept the night before. He supposed many men in the Sept had not slept.
Rhaegar gwr no crown.
He stood in plain black, and when the murmur rose to greet him, it rose like a storm wind and fell the same, gusting around stouter trees. He turned once, slowly, and his gaze was a net that took each man in it for a moment. He looked older than when he had left the city, as if the intervening weeks had been years. When at last he spoke, he did not climb to the pulpit but stood among them. "My father is mad," he said. The Sept inhaled all at once. He allowed them to do it. He was not always so, but he is now. I saw it before many of you would admit it, and I did not wish to see it. I will carry that sin more lightly than those that followed if I live long enough to feel the weight. He would have burned the city and called it cleansing. He would have heard your children cry and called it the Song of the Seven. He will not. I have sworn it. I will keep it. He paused. A man sneezed far back. Oberyn smiled without showing teeth. What shall we do with a king who is sick? Rhaegar continued, and hope and not hope braided in the words. We can chain him and hide him away, and yet the chain must be held in someone's hand. We can name him dead and cut the line at his throat, and the blood will splash far. We can say that kings are kings only when they are sane and become princes again when not, and that the law must account for this mercy and this exigency. He spread his hands. Call me king if you wish. Call my son king if you wish. Call me only regent for a line that must be saved from its own fire. But do it with the realms I open. Do it so that our children do not come to this place again, and kneel where you kneel and ask a boy to tell them who they are. Tywin Lannister's voice cut among the responses like a bell. It is not the business of a council to preserve a house, he said. He did not bother to stand for courtesy. Courtesy and Tywin had an understanding. It is the business of a council to preserve the realm. Aerys' line is a danger to that preservation. We can dress your words in law and bathwater warmth if it pleases the faith, but they boil down to this. Are we to risk burning again because a prince loves the sound of his own songs? There was a murmur in which love and envy braided and then frayed. Rhaegar looked toward the Lannister seats, and in the short space before he replied, Elia felt shame on his behalf that he must answer at all. But she sat very straight and did not tilt her head toward Oberyn even once. It is not my songs I ask you to hear, Rhaegar said. It is what your own bells tell you when you hear them sounding fire. Robert had come, after all. He came to the Sept late and in pain, and the pain had sharpened him until the edges threw off sparks. In the debates of the morning, he had kept his words few and low, surprising men who had come to be shaken or roused. Now he rose and stared at the prince who had taken Lyanna with as much tenderness as if he were plucking a stage rose from behind his ear. He said, "If we are afraid of burning, no man will ever light a hearth again. Your father burned with no need of rebellion. He set fire to men before we took up arms. He burned because the sight of red pleased him and because he believed himself above consequence. You part him from yourself like a rotten limb and ask us to watch you write a law that makes it proper. You ask us to tell ourselves we are good men because we did not have to bloody our own hands. I will bloody mine. I will call him to account." The Sept simmered. Jon Arryn put his hand to Robert's forearm. "We can call him to account and still choose sense," he said quickly, low. "We can remove him and..." not set the realm on fire to warm ourselves. The High Septon murmured prayers that were also admonitions and closed his eyes as if to feel for the right path in the dark. Others spoke. Hoster Tully spoke for peace with a tired integrity that suggested he knew how seldom men got what they spoke for. Mace Tyrell spoke for tradition and for the natural order and for the crown as if it had personally blessed his table with good harvests. Oberyn waited until he could no longer be courteous. Then he rose and suggested, in the silkiest of tones, that if the realm wished to cast aside Targaryen blood so easily, it should perhaps cast aside Lannister and Tyrell gold while it did so. For both metals were stubborn things and had already proved themselves not to know when to bend. Tywin's mouth thinned. Mace's ears went red. And through it all Elia watched Rhaegar and saw, under his quiet, the hummock and rise of something old and solemn in him. He had believed in prophecy. He had believed that someone would be born who must be raised as if the world depended on his breath. He had taken Lyanna in belief and desire and fear, and Elia had borne his belief as she bore his children, carefully, like a cup of hot oil one must carry without spilling and without letting it cool. By the third day they had a way forward. It was new and awkward-tempered and would satisfy no man entirely, which was how Elia knew it had a chance. Aerys was to be judged by the faith as no man had been judged in living memory. A tribunal would name what he had done and declare his unfitness to rule. He would be confined for life in a place that was not the Red Keep, but neither was it comfortable exile. The Citadel offered a tower. Old Town was slow and steady enough to keep him and proud enough to be watched over by every eye in the realm. Rhaegar would be named protector and regent not as king but as steward for a line that might or might not continue to sit the throne. In 5 years, the council would reconvene. If Rhaegar had managed the realm without fire and without filling it with graves, if he had honored Dorne and fed the Reach and kept the Westerlands glossy and saved the Riverlands from dissolving, then the faith would bless him as king. If he had not, the crown would pass to another, named by a council that had not yet decided whether blood or merit or exhaustion would guide it. It was a solution born in unease, and this was its strength. Robert demanded more. He wanted Aerys dead by sword, not by years. He wanted Rhaegar's children stripped of claim. He wanted Lyanna's name spoken and Rhaegar's name spoken with it, and then both names sanctified or damned. In the end he took less. He took justice against the men who had burned Eddard's father and brother and watched as they died by the clean execution he could not give the old king. He took the promise that no man of Targaryen blood would force a marriage where one had been withheld. It was a small thing, an etiquette, but it meant something to him that was not about law. On the last day of the council, a messenger arrived with a drenched cloak that had once been blue and now was the color of wet stone. He asked for Rhaegar with cracked lips. He brought a message from an island in a storm, and it smelled of salt and ash and new milk. The storm had come to Dragonstone howling like an old god that remembered it was hungry. It took the Targaryen fleet where it lay like a housewife taking bread from a shelf and broke it over its knee. Rhaella labored through that storm. Her handmaids bled and prayed and bled again, and the midwife had no voice left by dawn. Viserys stood at the end of the bed with eyes too wide. He did not cry. When the child came, she came in a rush like a wave, small and slippery and so indignant at the cold that she wailed herself purple in the face. They named her Daenerys. Outside, half the masts in the harbor snapped like ribs. The storm washed ashore 2 bodies. A deckhand with a tattoo of a dragon on his breast, and a blue-lipped noble who had insisted on seeing the fleet through his spyglass until the glass cracked. When Rhaegar read the message, he closed his eyes and something inside him, some tautness, at last unclenched. "My sister," he said, and a softness came to his mouth that Elia remembered from a long-ago morning when he had read her a line from a book that he loved and had been absurdly pleased to learn she loved it too. Daenerys. Tywin Lannister watched that small smile and thought, "The world has just offered me another way into the weave." He wrote 2 letters that night. One, folded thick as a man's thumb, went west to Casterly Rock and named a daughter who would not be queen yet and must be made to forget her taste for it. The second went to Dragonstone with a blandness that only a madman or a genius could make apology from. An offer of protection, a gift of casks of oil, hands stretched across a stretch of bitter water. Rhaella would not take his protection. She took the oil. Oberyn Martell kissed Elia on both cheeks the way a brother kisses a sister upon parting before a fight. "You will have to live with him," he said. "While I have the luxury of despising him from Sunspear, tell me when to stop despising, if he earns it." "He has always wanted to earn something," Elia said. "What he earns and what he wants are not bedfellows in my experience." Oberyn murmured, and he went away smiling, to teach men that southern courtesy is as sharp as any northern winter. Eddard Stark came to the Sept alone before he left the city. He stood before the stranger's altar with the child in his arms. The baby woke and frowned at the painted face and then relaxed again, trusting his sleep. Eddard wished he could be brave in the simple way that babies are brave. He had a sentence ready for when Rhaegar asked him for the child, a sentence that picnicked with lies and truth and had tried on a dozen cloaks. He did not want to use it. He felt a gill. Tea that was not like others he had known. It was thick and clean and hot and did not mind burning him. He was in the Septri when Rhaegar appeared, as if the prince had known the hour by a clock only he heard. "You rode south," Rhaegar said, because there was no point pretending otherwise. His eyes went to the child and then to Eddard's face, and that was kindness. He did not linger on the boy. "I did," Eddard said. He had not expected his voice would find such steadiness. "My sister asked me to, before she died." Rhaegar gazed at the altar and then at Eddard. "You have seen much death, and every new one must look like the last from the corner of your eye," he said. "I will not take a child from a man who owes him to a promise. I have my own promises that already take more than they give." Eddard could not reply for a moment. "I will call him my own," he managed finally, "for his sake, to protect him." He did not add, "From Robert, from those who would make him a piece on their board, from the weight of destiny that breaks boys' spines." He did not add, "Perhaps from you." Rhaegar nodded. He looked older even then in the days after the trident. "If one day a thing must be said aloud," he said, "say it with this grace, that I refused what was mine because it was not mine to take. Tell him that I was not made of all iron." He shook his head, as if amused by himself. "And tell him, if you will, that I have already met a sister with his name, Daenerys." The smallest of smiles again. "Perhaps it will comfort him to know he belongs to a chain stronger than blood." They parted with no further promises. Eddard rode north with his men and the infant and his secret. The wind grew colder as they climbed, and he found his breath easier in that air. He counted the days. He counted in another way as well. Some nights he dreamed he returned to the Tower of Joy too late, and the child had never looked him in the eye. Those nights he sat up by the fire and watched the boy sleep until his breath matched that small rise and fall. Rhaegar took the chain of office as regent and wearer of the Sword of the Morning. Arthur's blade set aside now in a stand, its pale light a quiet rebuke in a corner that only the honest noticed. He met with Mace Tyrell and the Red Wine captains and sent enough bread south to keep Storm's End from eating itself again. Stannis Baratheon rode out under truce with a face like winter planks. He did not thank the man who fed his people, but he did hold Rhaegar's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and that was a kind of honor the prince respected more than 1,000 soft words. Rhaegar sent men to Old Town with the old king. The High Tower watched Aerys' arrival with a dispassion that came to be called wisdom in later song. Aerys sat sometimes at a window and sometimes he smiled. He liked the way the river shone like a shard of metal at noon. Tywin Lannister did not move quickly. He withdrew into the confidence of stone and began to weave. Cersei raged until raging was as air to her, and then she learned to hold it like smoke in her lungs as long as she might and let it out only where it would choke an enemy. She watched Jaime in his white armor and thought that the gods often made cruel jokes using matched pairs. Tyrion drank and laughed and read and learned what it is to be a man who hears the wind over a cliff before other men smell it. Elia sat the regent's right hand and received Sunspear's letters like the sea receives rain, unastonished. She walked the city in a litter sometimes and sometimes on her own 2 feet because she liked to feel its pulses through the soles of her slippers. She took her children to the fish market and let Rhaenys smell the different catches and guess their names and laughed when the girl guessed wrong with a fierceness that would carry her into adulthood if the gods let her. She held Aegon in the gardens and sang to him songs that had been her nurse's songs. The ones Rhaegar did not know and could not sing without turning them into something else. The regency became, like any long day, a matter of bread and numbers and the spaces between men where resentment pools. The Reach wanted back its dignity after the humiliations of the siege they could not break. The West wanted under the table what it could not ask for in open hearing. The Vale wanted to be thought above the river's pettiness. The Riverlands wanted to be believed about their grief. The North wanted to go home and bury its dead, which it did, and then it watched the South like a patient man watching a pot he knows will boil when he is not looking. Rumors came and went as quickly as ships in the bay. 1 week said Rhaegar would set aside Elia after all. The next swore he would crown her again every morning until she was as much saint as queen. Some swore Riella would bring Daenerys to court, and some swore she would go into the east to take the girl where no man would find her. Varys helped these stories along when they served him and strangled them when they did not. He moved in soft shoes and whispered prayers he did not know if he believed. He had a sense that the breath of the realm was a sickness and a cure both, and he tried to help it breathe evenly. On the edge of everything, in a keep that had survived too many storms to fear the next, Stannis Baratheon trained twice a day and looked at the sea with a fury that never grew tired. His brother drank in fits and then in silences, and when he laughed it made the birds start from the pines. Some nights Robert rode out by himself and swings of his hammer rang through branches like a bell. Winter would come. It always had. It would come to a realm where a child with silver hair stared at the sea as if to remember it when she slept, and where another child with dark hair and solemn eyes learned the names of the men who would die for him and the names of the whites men told as jokes to frighten washerwomen. It would come to a city that had not burned though it had wanted to. It would come to a throne that had cut Rhaegar's hand only once because he had learned to sit with a stillness that did not spill blood. One morning very early, when the city still clung to its dreams and the bakers had just begun to slap dough onto boards, Rhaegar went alone to the armorer's lane. He had not been there since the day a boy with a hammer had sung his name into a breastplate while the rubies flashed in the sunlight like pomegranate seeds. The lane smelled of oil and metal shavings. A smith looked up and started, and then bowed with a clatter of tongs. Your Highness," he stammered. "I need a scabbard mended," Rhaegar said, holding out the leather. It was a thing any man might have carried. He owned a dozen like it. "I will wait." As the man took it his hand shook. "That's not your place, my." Rhaegar smiled with a tired kindness. "Today it is," he said, and sat on a low wall where countless men had sat before him, and looked at the sky. In it were a few high clouds like wool snags left behind by a giant's hand. He thought of prophecies, of how useful and useless they were, of how they made you feel like time was a thing you could see coming if only you squinted, when in truth it was like rain and came when it would. He thought of the boy in the north, wrapped in a wolf's cloak. He thought of his sister on an island in a storm and the plump little fist she must have had. When the scabbard was returned, stitched cleanly, the smith would take no coin. Rhaegar pressed it on him anyway. "Bread," he said. "For your children," he added, because he could not help his own old habits. "And a book for yourself. Every man needs one lesson he has not yet learned." He walked back up to the Red Keep through the market where a woman was hawking apples with a voice that could peel paint, where a boy chased a dog, where two men argued about the price of salted cod with the patience of men who have been arguing since birth. He entered the keep with the guard's salute half its usual crispness because the guard had not yet broken his fast. He climbed the stairs to the council chamber and stood for a moment looking at the chair that was not a throne, polished smooth by the backsides of men afraid to be remembered for too much. Elia came in a few moments later, her hair braided with a simple cord. "You are out early," she said. "I like the city when it is honest," he answered. She lifted a brow. "Is it ever honest?" "In the hour between sleep and bread," he said. "After that it tells itself what it must to endure the day." "She Saturday you are becoming a poet again," she said with dry affection. He shook his head. "I am tired of poems," he said, and then, after a pause, he added, "But not of songs." Elia looked at him and then at the morning light slanting through the lattice. "We will be well," she said. It was not a question. It was not quite a statement. It was a hope, that strongest and most fragile thing. He took his place. Outside, the bells began to ring for prime, and the sound rolled out over the city like a promise made in good faith and not quite believed. The counselors came in one by one, with their papers and their secrets, with their hungers and their sated bellies. Varys came last, smiling and thinking of the letters he would send to men who did not know yet that they were being watched. Tywin did not come that morning. He sent a message with 6 words and a seal that meant everything and nothing, and behind those 6 words lay a dozen roads. Oberyn had already left, relishing the taste of threats unsaid. Jon Arryn would arrive together with the river fog and a patient argument that made men feel as if honor were a chair they had not yet learned to sit upon correctly. Rhaegar placed his hands on the table and began the day's business. Far to the north, Eddard Stark crossed the threshold of his hall with the child in his arms. Catelyn came forward with eyes as cautious as a doe's, and then, as he knew she would, she steadied herself. He spoke the lie he had chosen, the lie that would keep the promise he had made, and something inside him broke and something else, stronger, set. He named the boy and the name felt right on his tongue. Through thin glass the winter light lay on the stones of the great hall like fine dust. Benjen came up later and took the boy to the window and showed him the wall, a line so far away it might have been a cloud learned to hold still. In a tower at Old Town, Aerys sat and watched the river. Sometimes he muttered, sometimes he laughed. Sometimes, when the light struck a certain way, he looked very young and very sane, as if he had wandered into the wrong story and did not know how to leave it. The Citadel kept its books and wrote new laws in careful script, and from time to time a novice would peer through a cracked door at the old man who had once been king and would shake his head as if to rid it of a bad dream. On Dragonstone, in a chamber whose walls sweated salt, Rhaella sang to her daughter of a home she would never see again as a child, maybe not at all. Viserys stood at the doorway, thin as a question, and listened with a yearning so raw it might have cut anyone who touched it. Rhaegar held the line between what was owed and what was possible. He picked up and bound books with his free hand while he held the realm with the other. He made mistakes and he knew them even as he made them and could not always prevent himself. This was the human thing he had always been shy of admitting. Winter came on padded feet. The ravens carried messages wrapped in ribbon and in string and in nothing at all. In years to come some would say that this was the last year of the old peace, and some would say that peace had ended long before, in a tower, in a hall, in a field where a boy in a stag's helm swung a hammer, at a tourney where a crown of flowers meant too much. But for a while, men rose and ate and went about their business, and at night they laid their heads down thinking that the city had not burned and that the smell of rain was not so bad. When it snowed for the first time in King's Landing that season, children ran out to catch flakes on their tongues and laughed at the taste of ash that clung always, faint and old, to the city's air. Elia wrapped her children in furs that had been given as gifts by a lord who liked to be thought generous. Rhaegar watched the flakes melt on the iron edges of the throne and thought how easily blood could look like snow in the right light. He placed his palm against the cold iron and did not bleed. The day would come when he would. Comes for all who try to hold what cuts. Until then, he would sit and listen, and he would learn to keep the wildfire out of men's mouths, and he would regard his sister's name like a talisman, and he would trust a man in the north with a promise that had saved a life and bruised them both into their honor. It was not a perfect world. It never had been, not even when dragons wrote their heat across the sky and men called it glory. But it was this world, the one they had made by choosing not to burn. And sometimes that was enough to go on with until the next choice came, and the next,